So when I'm trying to profile a player, obviously I'm watching the action. Most importantly, I'm watching, okay, how often are they playing? Are they raising? Are they playing aggressively? But in addition to that, I'm trying to profile them sort of away from the table. And the personality traits I think that best do that is simply how talkative and engaging they are, right? Typically, a player who is more chatty and whatnot is going to be a little more loosey-goosey, probably gets has tilt issues maybe because they get bored in certain situations and they're there to have some fun and action. Personality types that are typically more quiet, I would expect to be maybe a little bit more on the conservative side. Now, these are not steadfast rules. Like, these are general stereotypes, and you should first and foremost focus on the cards you're turning over. But what someone does for a living, if they're a professional poker player, it's quite obvious that they're going to be relatively tight and aggressive for the most part. But otherwise, age, other mannerisms that they may have. There's a whole bevy of things that you can look at outside of just simply the way that players play their cards that'll give you information in terms of who they likely are, in terms of, how they're going to play in big, stressful situations. The best way to exploit your opponents, first and foremost, pay attention. Not only pay attention to the hands they turn over, but if it's a player you've never played with before that's just sat down, pay attention to his mannerisms. Pay attention to what he's wearing. Pay attention to how well kept he is. You'll find little tells and little nuggets that will tell you a little bit about how this person thinks about life and how they're going to approach poker. So imagine, you have a guy, he's got yellow fingernails, he smokes a ton, he's sweaty, his hair's unkept, it's growing out of the back of his neck, right? And you look at this guy, and he's coming in and he's limping into the first pot. Self-discipline may be a struggle for this guy, organizational skills. So he's more likely to be like a looser player. Conversely, maybe you take a person who comes in wearing a pressed shirt, with a pocket pen in here and perfectly kept hair. Now this player more likely to be on the conservative side and careful. So all these little things are not, always or nevers, right? But they can help you to make decisions better. And ultimately, what's really going to help you is when you start to see what hands are turning over and the ways in which they're playing their hands. And are they aggressive? Are they weak? And that first 20 to 30 minutes you play with somebody new, super important to focus on them and try to get an understanding of who you're dealing with. While it's obviously important to really pay attention when you're playing a hand and you're on the flop, turn, and river, it's equally, well, maybe not equally, but pretty darn close to as important to pay attention when you're out of the hand, because you're going to pick up so much information sometimes that will be valuable. I have a real-life example of this. I was playing in a World Series of Poker event with a guy named Mike Matusow. And Mike, in the first hour, was not paying any attention at all when he was out of pots. He ends up getting involved with the tightest player at the table who never bluffed, always had the absolute best possible hand imaginable. So it was a hand where that player raised, Mike re-raised, the player re-raised again, Mike went all in with a pair of queens. And everyone at the table was like, Mike, this guy has aces, you didn't know that? So because Mike wasn't paying attention, he lost a huge pot that he could have gotten away from. And that'll happen to you too. Like, if you don't notice that this player on your left has been bluffing 5-6 times in a row, you'll find yourself in a marginal situation. You say, well, you know what? I should fold this hand. If you would have been paying attention, maybe you would have adjusted your play. There's other things to be looking for too. Physical tells, tendencies, bet sizing. If you're not paying attention, you're missing out on free information. One of the many benefits of being able to play online poker is, note-taking. And, you can color code players. And typically what you want to do if you're going to color code certain players is group them into different categories. You've got your sharks, you got your whales, you got your recreational players, you got your maniacs, you got your tags, which is the tight aggressive players, you got your lags, and you can create a wide spectrum of groupings. And then it's important to look for tendencies when you're putting players into a group. Like, what are you looking for when you're looking for a whale, right? So a whale is essentially obviously like a big fish, somebody who's very, very bad at poker and is going to lose a lot of money. So what are we looking for from tendencies from that player? Well, a whale is typically going to be someone who's got a high propensity to play a lot of hands. We call that a VPIP, which means voluntary put in pot. That's how often he's playing hands. Also, how often is he raising? Is he raising a lot or is he just calling a lot? Typically, a whale is going to have a profile that looks like high VPIP, means plays a lot of hands, but also doesn't do a lot of raising, very meek, very weak, calls all the way around to the river, doesn't take initiative, and it loses at a rate like that. So you see that sort of tendency. You can almost certainly categorize that player as a whale. Conversely, you see a player that's playing maybe like just 20% of the hands. And when he does, 17% of the time, he's raising them. So he's 3-betting. He's playing very aggressively. Well, the chances are that's more likely to be a pro. Seems more like a tag, which is like a tight, aggressive type player. There's various types of pros as well you're going to run into. That's why you can almost separate them into two groups, the tags and the lags. What is the lag? The lag is the loose, aggressive player. Those ones can be difficult to play against as well, and they're important to note as well. So a loose, aggressive player is still going to be aggressive, but they're going to just do that with a lot more hands, so they're going to have a weaker range. The tight, aggressive player, you can define a little bit more clearly their range. Now, a maniac is typically someone who also plays a lot of hands and plays them aggressively, but without any sort of real plan or game plan or any balance to it. So it becomes very readable. Against the maniac, you just know they probably don't have it because they're always bluffing. A loose aggressive player understands how to pull back, how to have texture and finesse to his game. So while they're playing a lot of hands and they play aggressively than they do, they also know when to get away. Maniacs, you don't want to mess with a maniac. Just press the check button. Check, check, check. Let them bet for you, and then wait for the river, and then take all their chips. So the value here really is essentially road mapping a table for yourself so that you have a much better idea going forward of who you're up against, how to defend against that. So that's something you can do online, right? But you can also do it live. Well, the thing you need to also understand is when you're categorizing players into different groups, you can put them into 4 groups, sure, if you choose to, but there's an infinite number of groups. There's all types of player types. You have some player types that actually shift and change based on how they're doing in the game. So you might have a player who is normally a tag, who's very tight aggressive, but then when he loses 3 pots in a row, he goes from tag to maniac. So we're going to call him a hybrid player, right? So you want to pay attention to that. There's a whole bunch of different groupings. You may have some tighter players who do a lot of bluffing. You may have some tighter players who do almost no bluffing. There's an endless stream of groupings that you can put players into. And again, as I mentioned, with online poker, it's even more easy and accessible to do that because you can keep notes and very specific notes on players. You can look at hand histories later and really kind of deeply study what your opponents are doing. What you'll generally see, at the lower stakes is a wide variety of player types, a lot more looser, beginner, but as you move up in stakes and you get to the highest levels, you slowly progress and you're going to see just a lot more tags, lags, and pros, right? Tight aggressive players, mostly tight aggressive players, some loose aggressive as well, and, just really good overall players that can ebb and flow between that. And you start to see a lot less of the limping. You see a lot less of the just calling or the totally honest ranges where they bet with top pair and check when they don't have it. So as you move up in stakes, your ability to read players becomes enhanced and more important because everyone is playing at a much higher level. So, we've talked about paying attention. It's super important, right? So you're going to see players at the table, bluff other players and do all kinds of stuff. And you definitely want to keep that in your memory bank. But it's also important to note that the dynamic changes when it's used specifically, right? So if you notice that, John is picking on Bill, right? And bluffing him and all that stuff. But John's never actually bluffed you yet, right? So when John's in a pot, we don't necessarily give him credit for being able to bluff us until he's actually done it to us. So while we take this information in, you have to understand the dynamic. Maybe John's afraid of you. Maybe he doesn't want to mess with you, but feels like he can bully Bill. So the dynamic changes person to person. It's still extremely valuable from a tendency perspective to see how often this person is willing to bluff at all, but understand as well that, that may change against player, A versus player B. The most profitable player type to play against is obviously for me personally, I think, the beginning weak player, the weak, timid one that's not going to put you in spots to guess. Some might call a maniac easier, more profitable to play against. And while you could make, you win big pots of a maniac, it's also going to put you in a lot of tough spots and head-scratching situations that might put you to the test for all your chips. A weak, timid beginning player, they're going to play so honest and so straightforward. I mean, just think about it. Isn't it easier to play against somebody when you know pretty much what their hole cards are? And that's the type of player that I will push around when they don't have anything, and I'll get away when they do. Remember now, we don't do like an always or a never. So when you see a beginning player come to the table, we can infer some ideas about how they're likely to play, but there's no always or never. So typically, what you're going to see if you see a beginning player is, as far as a profile goes, they're usually going to be weak, timid, and loose. So you're going to see a player that limps in and just calls the bet. And remember, that's not something we really want to do. If you're in a game where other people are doing it, we can get away with it sometimes. But typically, if you're coming into a hand, you want to be raising. So a beginning player is usually not going to do a lot of bluffing. They're going to play very honest ranges after the flop. So when they bet, that means they like their hand and they've got top pair or something good like that. And when they check, they're less likely to. So beginning players, when I approach one, I usually typically think, all right, this is going to be an ABC type player. Weak, I'm going to out-fundamental them. When they check, I'm going to take pots from them. Certainly, always happy to see beginners come to my table. Or any new player, that you've never seen before. You always assume first and foremost that this could be a good opportunity. Without question, the easiest players to play against are passive players. So a passive player is going to check and call a lot more hands than a more aggressive player who may check raise or bet himself. So you have to assume that when a player check calls a lot and they're passive, it doesn't mean the same thing as an aggressive player. So you might want to give it a little bit more credit to some degree. If they ever do raise you a passive player, you should always assume that's a much stronger hand than the average player would have. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to get away from a lot of second best hands. So you make a very good flush on the river, but your opponent raises you and he's a very weak passive player. Well, what are they going to raise you with? If that player doesn't bluff very often, you can make a jack high or a queen high flush and realize, you know what? That player's got it. I can fold. Whereas against an aggressive player, you're never going to fold that hand. Probably one of the more common questions I get is, how do you deal with aggressive players? Nobody wants to play with aggressive players, especially beginners. They're just very frustrated by it because partly this game was designed to be an aggressive player. An aggressive player tends to mean a good player, right? Obviously, you can take that to the extreme and become a maniac. Now, if we feel like a player is going past aggression to maniac level, the real only defense you have is to play a slightly tighter range against that player, range of hands, and also slow play more often. So if your opponent's tendency and their weakness is that they bet too often and they bluff too often and they are overly aggressive, then naturally we deviate the other way. We don't get into a war where we try to out-aggress the player. Maybe occasionally to send them a message that that basically to make your other strategy work, where you are going to sort of play rope-a-dope. But it's actually quite simple against most aggressive players. Don't get involved in the emotion of it. Understand that the aggressive player, if they're very aggressive, they're going to win more pots than you, okay? They're probably going to win more pots than you, but the goal at the end of the day is not to win more pots, it's to win more money. There's no question that obviously if you're playing against aggressive players, it requires more mental energy, because you're going to be put to the test more often. They're going to keep you on the defense. They're going to force you to really think through hands. And, the opposite type of player is, the weak passive player, and they never put you to the test. They allow you to control the game. So you never want to be the weak passive player unless the aggressive player is so overly aggressive that he ends up making it easy for you, right? If a player is playing far too aggressively, then they don't really stress me out. I just play my game, wait for the situations, and they will trap themselves. They'll fall in without my help.